From somewhere in beautiful downtown Burbank, NBC once more tries to prevent...
Warning, this radio show may be hazardous to the establishment media. You are about to embark on a cultural and intellectual journey steeped in sound. Bassists, composers, and authors David C. Gross and Tomaso Semioli welcome you to Notes from an Artist, featuring interviews, music, and auditory collages. Together, you will explore artistry that knows no boundaries, challenges the status quo, and sparks your imagination. David and Tomaso know the rules and how to break them. Don't touch that dial. Buy the ticket. Take the ride. Get in on the conversation. Get in. Notes from an Artist. Get in. Notes from an Artist.
Susie?
Yes.
Susie Cream Cheese?
Yes.
This is the voice of your conscience, baby. I just want to check one thing out with you. You don't mind, do you?
What?
Susie Cream Cheese, honey, what's got into you?
Who are the great police?
Very interesting.
What do you mean, very interesting? It was stupid.
Yes, it was stupid. But it was also very interesting.
Hi there, nice to be with you. Happy you could stick around. Like to introduce Legs Larry Smith, drums. And Sam Spoon's rhythm pole. And Vernon Dudley Bohay Knoll, bass guitar. And Neil Innes, piano. Come in, Rodney Slater alto saxophone. With Roger Ruskin Spear on tenor sax. Hi, Vivian Stanchel, trumpet. Big hello.
Nothing takes it off like Noxema medicated shave. Take it off. Take it all off. Nothing takes it off like Noxema medicated shave.
The closer you shave, the more you need Noxema. Noxema medicated comfort shave.
Welcome to the show, Colin.
Really appreciate you having me on. Nice to see you, gentlemen.
All right, David, for the benefit of our audience member, let's introduce Colin. And all this information is from the internet, Colin, so it's got to be true. Colin is the author of the book The Midnight Special, The Secret Prison History of American Music on W.W. Norton. That's out now, yes?
It is, yes, since June 30.
All right, it's out since June 30th, David. So get yourself to a fine bookstore.
I have two copies. I've got a PDF. And I have the book. So
you have the book. So Jeff Bezos will personally pack you a book if you order it on Amazon. Now, let's talk about Colin's life. It's a fascinating life he's led. You're a freelance writer. Your work has appeared in Los Angeles Review of Books, the Boston Globe, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Correct?
Correct, yes.
All right. You teach reading and writing as an instructor at Kingsborough Community College. Now, that has to be a challenging endeavor given ChatGPT and AI.
Yes, I've had that job before those things existed. It was always challenging, but yes, it is getting worse over time, no doubt.
It's kind of difficult to hold a pen with your thumbs, I guess, for that age group.
Yeah, I tell you, I mean, a lot of us are going back to pen on paper because there's no other way to know if people are actually doing the work. My classroom feels a lot like the 1960s sometimes. Pen on paper, oral exams, you know.
That's
yeah, I read something recently about some college where they are forcing the kids to do that and eliminating any AI from any of their papers and such. It's a good thing.
Yeah, agreed. I don't understand the fascination. I don't understand why you would sign up for college and then, have some robot do the work for you. But many people seem to think it's a solid choice.
But now these you have college students, so they're between 18 and 21. How GPT savvy are they?
Good question. I mean, I should note, community college, in my classroom, any given semester, the age range is probably more like 18 to 50.
Okay.
And so, yeah, the savviness, there's a wide range of savviness. Coming straight out of high school, savvy. They know how to use it. The problem is nobody's really called them on it. So they don't know how to hide it because, their high school teachers are overworked. They get, 200 papers in a day. And if it sounds semi-coherent, you give it a check and you keep it moving. And then you get to college where instructors have time to look more closely. And then it's very clear to us that, the work was actually composed by AI. So they're not savvy in that sense. They do know how to use the tools. They don't know how to like bridge the divide between what they actually understand and can speak about and then what appears on the page. And they don't know how suspect that is.
Well, it's funny you say that because my daughter just graduated Pratt, and there were a couple of assignments that she had me help her with. And I said, the first thing you got to do is if you're using AI, get rid of any of the hyphens. That's a clear giveaway that it's AI. But obviously being a photography major, there are very few hyphens or stuff. But it's very interesting. There are certain real telltale signs whether you're using AI or not.
Yeah,
I do a Substack column, a weekly thing, and they have put into place AI, so they will flag if your article is AI, which I think is kind of cool in its own way.
Well, I was a journalist for 20 some odd years before AI. I'm old enough to remember when you couldn't use a calculator on a math test. But much of what I read today is repurposed content it's not really a writer. They're taking material from 15, 20 years ago and they're just putting a fresh coat of paint on it. So, one of the reasons why I like reading hard copy books is because it's tangible. It's something I could relate to. There's your book, if I can.
No, you've got the background, so you can't really see it.
There's the background, you can't see it. But you're teaching you also are a fellow of the New York Foundation of Arts and Nonfiction Literature. Nice work if you can get it. Now, I see fascinating history. You were born in West Virginia, but you were raised in Brooklyn, New York, where I was born, and you left high school early and you spent a decade in California. You worked as a bike messenger. You stocked shelves in warehouses and you drove a truck. I lived in San Francisco while you were at the City College of San Francisco. I would imagine in your line of work as a messenger and stocking shelves, you probably ran into some people that served prison time.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yes. I mean, I had a knockabout sort of a life. Yeah, I mean, amongst messengers, I find it's actually funny to talk about being a bike messenger now. People don't, it's like talking about buggy drivers or something, right? They just don't exist. And so I always have to explain. But yes, I was one of those guys. If you were living in New York or San Francisco from the 80s to the, I guess, early 2000s, we'd be zipping around through traffic, carrying letters back and forth and large documents before email could do that. And yeah, it's, as a high school dropout, it was great work. I made decent money. I was outside all day, but it's also the sort of thing that you end up in, if things don't go so well sometimes. I mean, there were messenger companies who specifically hired folks coming right out of county jail or coming out of the state prison system. It was a job you could get. So yeah, sure. Plenty of the folks who were on the road with me back then had done some kind of time.
And you also worked in homeless services, which was a big problem when I was in San Francisco.
And still is, yeah. I mean, the transition was essentially, a kid growing up in the poor into working class, and then eventually deciding I was going to sort of try to help with that same circumstance. I got into homeless services, and eventually threw my hands up and said, this isn't doing enough. Let me write about it. And that was my transition into journalism, which then, has transitioned into this other career I have now, writing creative nonfiction and writing books.
Interesting.
Well, what's interesting about this too is Tom and I, we have a Flipboard magazine. And when I was reviewing it one day, there came your article on Elmo Hope. And just to tell all, about 2 or 3 years ago, I started getting into Elmo Hope. I had really never had heard of him.
Oh, brilliant.
And so when I started reading this article, I'm like, oh my God. And then I go a little further and I go, oh my God. And then I go a little further. And there was nothing good. It's just completely, and we'll get into the book in a second, but it wasn't until the end of the book where it says, Colin Asher, Midnight Special. I immediately emailed Tom and said, we've got to get this guy on the show. And I got to tell you, and I've been telling Tom this every time we talk about it, the book reads fantastically. It really, really does. It's a great story. Oddly enough, it's true, which is really even more frightening. Folks, this is not Cool Hand Luke. This is actually a real live situation with prisons and musicians and other folks. So, Tom, tell us about the book.
Well, one of the things that struck me is just about, you're really describing the prison industrial complex. And prison industrial complex is the fastest growing business in the U.S. And I'm always fascinated. I started doing the research just on the prison industrial complex, and I learned we have the largest prison. The United States is the largest prison population in the world. 1.9 people incarcerated across federal, state, and local facilities. And we hold 25% of the world's prisoners, despite the fact that we're only 5% of the world's population. And we're much, much higher than Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Kazakhstan. And the United States system is more punitive than most Western democracies because we rely on incarceration and fewer alternatives like probation and community service. Again, prison is a big business. And we also have the highest rates of recidivism and long-term disenfranchisement. And you see that in your book. And it's kind of interesting, Colin, because Hollywood sort of glamorizes violence. It glamorizes war. It glamorizes the individual over the collective. We never see a superhero organizing a group of citizens to peacefully resolve a conflict, right? We got to blow stuff up and kill people. And of course, through that, and you see.
What's wrong with that, Tom?
What's that?
There's something wrong with that?
Is there something wrong with that? Right. Obviously, it perpetuates racism, right? The Germans, the Russians, the Middle Easterns, they're all dark-skinned people are always the bad guys or girls. And again, we see that in your book. So it's no surprise that criminals are glamorized in American films. Why not be glamorized in American music? And that's where your book comes in. Just moving around, you start off with Udi Ledbetter. I didn't realize that was Leadbelly. And now, of course, I'd heard of Leadbelly, and of course, everybody cites him as an influence. But when you started getting into the songs, I was like, oh my God, this is the whole repertoire of 1960s and 70s blues. It's Hot Tuna, it's the Allman Brothers, it's Paul Butterfield, it's Michael Bloomfield, it's Taj Mahal. It's really remarkable the influence that this man had, and he lived a pretty awful life, in and out of jail, beaten, shot.
Indeed, he did. Before I lose track of it, David, thank you so much for the kind words. Let me just say that, and also just always wonderful to hear anybody say they know who Elmo is.
Okay.
One of the great joys of writing the book was getting deep into Elmo's work. He was a genius. More to your point, Tom, or to your question. Yeah, I mean, the book, just for your listeners, right, the book is trying to make this argument that policing and incarceration have always played a role in shaping American musical culture. And chronologically, I start, as you say, with Udi Ledbetter, which, most people know as Leadbelly, and mid-90s, there's an afterword that brings things slightly more up to date. And over the course of that time, I'm trying to track, what specifically in this time period did the influence of policing and incarceration have on the way we perceive criminality, on the way people are able to pursue careers, or on the way people sing about or talk about, sort of the outlaw lifestyle, right? This is something you touched on. I started with Leadbelly for a few reasons. One, he, as you say, he has this massive footprint in American music. So once I can get people into that section, I think then I can convince them of how important the subject is, just because, he recorded hundreds of songs that are still being re-recorded. Also, his story is sort of archetypal. For your listeners, I'll just give a little snapshot. It's interesting. I've been doing a lot of events to promote the book, and I have yet to accurately guess which artist people will know the most about. I always assume everybody knows who Leadbelly is, but I think that that's probably a fault of mine. Leadbelly was born Hughie Ledbetter, in the 1880s. He was born on land that used to be a slave plantation, and he grows up in the Jim Crow South. To your point, fairly early in his life, he gets in some trouble, and he's dealt with by the Jim Crow justice system. He ends up on a chain gang that he escapes from, and he ends up later in some trouble. The exact details of this conflict are still sort of contested, but it seems like he shot somebody in self-defense. After a one-day trial, he gets convicted of murder and ends up on a Southern prison farm. After his release, he gets in trouble again, is convicted of attempted murder. This becomes a big part of his mythology when he becomes a public figure, which I'll talk about in a second. I argue in the book that the record supports the idea that he was actually attacked by a group of white men in the South and then blamed for defending himself. For that, he does get convicted of attempted murder and goes to Angola. As you point out, in all of those circumstances, he's treated in ways that, as brutal as American prisons are now, are beyond the pale. He's whipped. He tries to escape. He's chased down by dogs. He's miserable enough. He tries to kill himself at one point. All of these things, all of these experiences contribute to the body of the work that he later produces. He learns a lot of songs in prison. He adapts a lot of songs in prison. It was a different era. He was in prison with his guitar. He was granted permission to move about on these, massive prison farms, some of which were, 5, 6, 7,000 acres. Lots of musicians there, trading licks, trading songs over the course of years that he's there. So it shapes his music making. But more importantly, and this is something I end up talking a lot about, and which is incredibly important, I think, the overall history that I'm trying to chart, those prison experiences end up defining him in the public mind. When he leaves the South, he goes to New York. He's brought north by John and Alan Lomax, which are names that many people might know. And in the North, he's not originally actually known for his musicianship, right? I mean, man was a genius. He knew hundreds of songs by heart. But that's not really in beautiful voice. So it's not what he becomes known for. What he becomes known for originally is just his prison experience. And not even
Lomax
really
exploits him,
yeah.
really.
Lomax absolutely exploits him. I know Lomax still gets a lot of respect
John
for
Lomax.
reasons that befuddle me.
Yeah.
I should say there's a meaningful distinction. There's two Lomaxes, right? John and Alan. John's the father, Alan's the son. Alan these days is much more famous, and I would say should be considered separately. He did some great work. He was active for decades and decades, recording music and elevating artists who deserved it. That's Alan. John Lomax had a much briefer career. And, as is evident in his writings and his public pronouncements, was, to my ear, an out-and-out bigot.
Yeah.
He had these ideas about Black music that held that, Black music and Black expression was most pure, his terms, when it was performed by people who were as separated from white society as possible. And the best place really was prisons, because, this was, the place where Blackness was as authentic as it could be. And this is what he ends up seeing in Leadbelly, a pure Black artist. And for him, that very much definitely means an artist who has been to prison, who has done something violent, and his expression should be filtered completely through that lens. So when they get to New York together, John Lomax ends up promoting Leadbelly not as a brilliant artist, but as, the virtuoso of the knife and guitar, longtime convict of Southern prison farms. It says things like he has no sense of morality or ethics and no idea how to use money. Things like this. Um, that ends up being what Leadbelly's known for. There are newspaper stories about him with national syndication. There's a newsreel that plays before films for months that promote sort of the criminal mythology and not the realities of the Jim Crow justice system that Leadbelly experienced. They talk about him being a double murderer, even though he was not convicted of murder twice. They talk about him, as a violent savage, almost in exactly those terms. And they promote the idea that that's what makes his expression, interesting and relevant and worth listening to. During all this time, actually,
You point out in the book from the change from the Civil War, pre-Civil War, where black people were seen as buffoonish and less intelligent than whites, and now all of a sudden, post-Civil War, now they're seen as a criminal element, which keeps them oppressed.
Absolutely, right. The myths shift as the utility shifts, right? During slavery, you need to have some sort of rational justification, and then you get these ideas about black folks being less intelligent and childlike, and so they need, the protection of slavery. And as obnoxious and odious as that myth is, you can't really hang on to it after the end of the Civil War. So then you need to, well, what are you going to do? You're not actually going to reshape the power structures of the South, so that instead you have prisons expand to take the place of plantations. And if you're going to put people in prison, you need a new myth, right? And that myth becomes the myth of the violent black man, right? So we're going to stop pretending people are childlike, and now we're going to pretend that they're violent, uncontrollable savages. And, Lomax very much plays into that with Leadbelly.
What was so interesting is when I was reading that section, and mind you, I said to Tom earlier, I thought it was Huddy. So that was an interesting thing after all these years. I'm telling you, a lot of years. Hootie, not Huddy. But here are the two things that I found interesting. One, he was sort of almost like a rock promoter with a band like Kiss in its own way. Do you know what I mean? And the other thing was, exploitating the musician just as they always have done.
Right, he used him as a valet, etc. Yeah.
Well, I'm talking about the money. I mean, what did it make? $298 after a 3-month tour.
Yeah, I mean, a few things there. Yeah, absolutely. John saw himself as a promoter. I mean, interestingly, he also rationalized some of this because he saw himself as part of the talent. He would sometimes sing with Leadbelly. I'll set aside whether or not there was merit to his singing. But yes, yeah.
When you were talking about the criminal element, it was interesting how when the Bureau of Narcotics, I'm jumping ahead to the Elmo story for a second, that basically getting rid of pot was because it was primarily around the black musicians. So to me, it was, so they're murderers and rapists and this, that, and the other thing. So now they're drug addicts. What's next?
So yeah, if you want to jump ahead a little bit, the second section of the book focuses mostly on the development of modern jazz. The main character there, Elmo Hope, who David brought up earlier, he was best friends with Bud Powell and Thelonious Monk, really at the heart of things in New York City when modern jazz is being developed. Just as a quick side note, originally this book was just supposed to be that section. That was my first vision. And that sort of grew out of my own ignorance. I was born in the 80s. For my generation, jazz is like high class music.
Interesting.
You go and you sit at a little round table and you order drinks that I can't afford to order. And I liked it, but it was a very intellectual endeavor. And I got past that in my 20s and 30s and
what jazz were you listening to? Because David and I are of the jazz fusion era. We're a couple of years older than you. And a couple of decades, couple of generations older than you. What jazz music were you exposed to?
As a kid, I mean, very little. And for the reasons that I said, it was just this sort of distant thing. I would hear it. It would sound, virtuosic. But then, when I was in my 20s or 30s, do you guys ever listen to Guru's Jazzmatazz albums?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Big fan. Acid jazz was the rage in San Francisco when I was there.
Yeah, so I think for a lot of kids who grew up listening to hip hop the way I did, Guru was the entryway, right? And
Yeah.
those, I mean, those albums, amazing artists on there. So
Yes.
that again, so then I started learning a bit more about jazz and eventually a little bit about the history. But I do think, at least for folks around my age, there is this idea that, jazz is sort of an upper class pursuit.
Interesting.
And I was listening a lot to this album, Sounds from Rikers Island, that ends up anchoring this portion of the book. And I thought, this is a great contradiction. This is worth mining, right? You've got this modern jazz album that's all about how most jazz musicians playing in New York City have been through Rikers Island because they're facing constant harassment. And then you've got this perception of jazz as, modernism and genius and art. And, let's bring those histories together. That was actually the first version of the book that I pitched. And my editor said, "That's great. It's brilliant. I love it. But nobody buys jazz books. So you gotta do something bigger." He said, just do the same thing in different time periods. And that's how we got to where we are. Anyway, David, finally to come back to your question. Yeah, I mean, modern jazz musicians were very much reacting either implicitly or explicitly to the image that had been attached to Hughie Ledbetter and musicians of his era, where, if you had trouble with the law, the problem was never the law or the systems that were imprisoning you. The problem was always you, right? And then the issue always defined you in the public's mind. Modern jazz musicians, they didn't want that at all, right? They wanted their art to be considered on the level of their art. And biography was taken out of it. Jazz critics early on, modern jazz critics wouldn't really talk much about the biographies of musicians. And if you got in trouble, you hid it because you didn't want to be, a virtuoso of knife and guitar like Hughie Ledbetter was. You wanted to be considered an intellectual. So right there's this sort of politics of respectability happening, but then at the same time, like you're saying, David, the police are actually quite focused on jazz and on modern jazz, right? It's sort of a cultural threat. It's acknowledged as being art. It's not just party music anymore by the time we get into like the 50s, and the federal government takes an interest in tamping that down. They specifically go after jazz artists first for possession of marijuana. And then, when heroin becomes more of a problem nationwide, they start going after jazz musicians for heroin possession. And that looked different ways in different cities. But, the feds had task forces that would spy on jazz clubs. Local police would spy on jazz clubs. There are tons of stories about how, you couldn't be on the street, which is what they called the strip of Manhattan where all the jazz clubs were, without the police coming by and harassing people. Same thing in LA. There were some pretty notable raids in Philly. So yeah, there was this constant scrutiny and this perception perpetuated through the media also that jazz musicians were all drug addicts. There were stories where they would say explicitly, the biggest problem in modern narcotics is jazz musicians, which, I mean, if you spend a moment thinking about it, right, at the time we've got a country of 150, 200 million people. How many jazz musicians are there in America?
Well, it's interesting to read about that because that was the era that my parents grew up in. And then when I started showing desire to be a musician, right away, all my parents and their friends all equated musicians with drug addicts. And when I studied at University of Miami, which had its fair share of drugs there, most of the musicians, we were serious people. You can't study jazz. I minored in jazz. You can't study that music when you're stoned. You can't. And most of the musicians.
You think you can.
Yes, you think you can, right?
Yes, you think
Some
you can.
people think they can.
But most of the musicians I know and that David knows that worked in the New York studio system, which there are no studio musicians anymore, they were pretty responsible people. They were not, these guys that were strung out and things. You can't play at that level and be strung out. I mean, some people can. I mean, there are exceptions. But for the most part, I found that professional musicians were probably the most dedicated people, the straightest people you'd want to meet. There's a lot more cocaine on Wall Street than there was in the recording studio.
Well, Tom, I don't think you ever knew this, but, and Colin, you've never known it either. My uncle was Lionel Hampton's bass player. And when my folks found out I was going to be a bass player, because my uncle actually was a junkie. He ended up managing Lionel Hampton after a while, but truth be told, they had actual physical proof that obviously that was going to happen to me.
Yes.
You know, but yeah, so that stigma was right around. What I found fascinating is when you talk about that, the thing about marijuana. Wasn't it 1926 you cited was the year that they made that intense legislation, and I think wasn't Fiorello LaGuardia the mayor of New York at that time?
Just for context for your listeners, what you're talking about is the cabaret card law in New York City.
Yes.
And yeah, so this ends up being a problem for New York musicians, but I would say also just for the development of jazz in general, because modern jazz comes out of New York City. So 1926, there's a law passed through the city council. That's a good question about LaGuardia. I think you're correct, but I would want to double check before I went on the record.
You guys continue. I'm going to Google it.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, Google it for us. So 1926, there's a law passed saying that any club that wants to sell liquor and have live music has to have a cabaret license. And that license is given out by the police department. For a while, for good, yes. Well, for a good stretch of years, it only applies to the clubs themselves. And it was a problem, but not a massive problem. And then later on, by 1942, it sort of expanded and expanded again. And by 1942, any musician who wanted to perform in a cabaret in New York, which is a small club that sells liquor and has music, had to receive a license from the New York City Police Department. And there was no legislation saying on what basis the police department would approve or deny. So they had carte blanche. So what ends up happening is, you have largely Black musicians, although not entirely. The jazz scene was, for the time, quite integrated. But often you have Black musicians living in heavily policed Black neighborhoods, working in jazz clubs that are themselves being observed by the police. And they get picked up. And, maybe it's something real, maybe it's total nonsense, maybe it's possession, maybe it's jaywalking, right? Maybe you and your buddy raise your voices at each other and they decide to ticket you for, disturbing the peace or something. But if you've had anything on your record, even if it's just, an arrest that never leads to any sort of conviction or the DA even drops charges, when you go to renew your cabaret card, they will know about the arrest. And then it was just standard procedure to deny you. So it would trap
them off, as you mentioned.
Yes, yeah. So yes, there was an appeals process. If you had some money, you could get a lawyer, or you could. There were always rumors that there were bribes being accepted, and I don't have any direct proof of it, but I'd be very surprised if that wasn't the case.
Records of those things.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but that was the whole point of the cabaret court, pretty much.
Yes, and it would trap people. I mean, Elmo's a good example.
Right.
Elmo, unfortunately, did have a drug problem. He sought treatment for it repeatedly, really didn't want to, but he was highly functional for years. As far as I can tell, he once said on the record that he started using when he was drafted into the Army, 43. And he worked regularly. He worked with a touring R&B band, and he worked around the city a bit. He worked regularly until 1950, until he gets picked up. And then things just... they just start going down the drain because it cascades. Once you get picked up for something, then you can't work. And if you can't work and you have a habit, how are you going to feed it? Right. And the answer for a lot of people was petty crime. Not stuff that I actually feel all that morally judgmental of, but, there was theft and, Elmo a couple times went into the backseat of somebody's car and snatched a suitcase, right? Not great behavior, but not like wildly antisocial behavior either. And there's no question that if he could have continued working in clubs and recording, and that's absolutely what he would have preferred to do. But the cabaret card system would trap people like that, and you get cut off from your performance income, then you're not going to get any recording jobs either, right? And if you're not playing regularly, nobody's going to pick you up for a tour. So it really had the ability to end careers. Unless you were lucky enough that you already had a big name by the time.
Well, it's interesting that he never went to Europe, Bud Powell, right? I mean, I bet you Elmo would have thrived in Europe.
He probably would have. Yeah, I don't know. Elmo, I learned a lot about Elmo. There are ways in which he's sort of a black box. Powell had. I'm struggling for the word here. Somebody looking out for him. like a benefactor essentially,
Yes.
who helped him get to Europe and took care of him. Elmo never really had that.
Okay.
Powell also repeatedly lost his cabaret card in New
Yes,
York and
yes.
struggled in the same ways. And yeah, you're absolutely correct. A lot of jazz musicians, it just made rational sense to go to Europe. You had greater liberty to move about, and the work was more respected. The thing Elmo does do is he goes to California, and he does quite well out in California for several years. Records quite a bit, tours, is on a professional level more successful than he was in New York. Fortunately slash unfortunately, he was homesick, man. I mean, he really wanted to come back. He, I feel bad saying this, but he didn't really think much of the West Coast jazz scene. There's some good
It's
people
very
out
funny
there,
to hear
but
him slam the West Coast jazz scene. Yeah.
oh my God, yeah, he's savage, right? Talking about how there are 14-year-olds in New York who could outplay anybody on the West. And, so he wants to go home.
Right.
And he, at that point, he thought he was going to be able to get a cabaret card when he came back. There had been some scandal around cabaret cards. There was talk of reform. It just never worked out for him. He reapplied, didn't get it. And that's why everybody knows Bud Powell's name and Thelonious Monk's name, and they don't know Elmo's name. Elmo was right
David,
there with those guys.
Elmo could be the first jazz police before Winton came and trashed everybody.
No way, except he still was a great artist. Where
Yes.
Winton, I always had my suspicions. But what's interesting too is you bring up benefactor, and Monk had Pananica.
Right.
Powell, who had whoever Powell had. You get the feeling, particularly the way you wrote the story, is that he was really tied to whichever woman he was with at the time. So it was a little different for him. I think his needs may have been different. It could have been because he was shot very young. Unfortunately, we don't know. But when you think about it, it's very possible he needed to be in that familial, quote unquote, situation where the other two did not. And if you think about it, as famous as Monk was, he had a hell of a lot of problems with the cabaret card. Really, it was a terrible, terrible thing, that cabaret card, and everyone had to have it. The waiters had to have it. The dishwashers had to
It was
have
extortion. Well, you mentioned in the book, what was it, Sinatra in '67? Was that when the cabaret card? I think you meant. Okay.
Yeah. The law is finally undone in '67, just months after Elmo dies,
Yes.
sadly. But yeah, eventually there was a big campaign to get rid of it. And Sinatra, to his credit, came out on the side of the musicians. Yeah, it was, it's one of these things that,
And Frank had a lot of influence too, because a lot of his comrades owned clubs, David. These Italian American men who were in business for themselves.
Well, yeah, but he was also very much into all kinds of social rights.
Yes, he was. Yeah, Frank certainly.
And such. He was really he was a mensch in a lot of ways. He really was.
I mean, and not to undercut him, but it was also just indefensible by that point. I mean, there had been so much scandal around it for so long, but he was somebody who absolutely stepped forward. And at a certain point, nobody could rationalize it anymore. It's one of these things that, been on the books for so long, everybody pretended it was necessary, but there was no other city in the country that had a similar ordinance. So then how could it possibly be necessary, right?
Yeah.
Interesting, Colin.
Without using logic.
Colin, when you get into the '60s and the '70s now, I'm starting to remember these. Ike White is an absolutely fascinating story. As a matter of fact, you see his record at Record Store Day, Changing Times, which is a fabulous, fabulous record.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I'm ancient enough to remember Johnny Cash doing those prison songs. And again, interesting how, Ike was the real deal. And it's really another tragic story where he should not have been imprisoned the way he was. And then you had Johnny Cash sort of masquerading as an outlaw when he was far from it.
Yeah, well, chronologically, why don't we take those in order and talk about Johnny? Yeah, I mean, I always like to lead anytime I'm talking about Johnny, saying I'm a fan. He is
Yes,
not.
me too.
Yeah, no, he's not the devil in my book at all. And I had the wonderful experience of actually coming to like him more and more as I was writing about him, which, if there are any writers listening or you're a writer. That does not usually happen when you're really focusing
Have
in
you
on
ever been to
somebody's
the
life.
Johnny Cash Museum in Nashville?
I haven't, no.
That's a trip you have to put on your bucket
I'll
list.
go. Yeah, no, I'm headed to Nashville later this year, so I'll
Oh,
make sure I
you
go.
got yes, yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, Johnny, like you say, Johnny was able to benefit from like the iconography of prison and the sort of the romantic idea of the outlaw in a way that a lot of black musicians were not able to. He he engaged in plenty of the behavior engaged in by the other people in this book, but never paid any sort of price for it. He also struggled with drug use issues. He smuggled drugs into the country. He was repeatedly caught driving under the influence, wrecked cars, etc., etc. And he
But he
never
was
did
also
more.
big business, Johnny. He was a celebrity. He was a recording artist,
Mhm.
and you can't put your recording artist behind bars. He won't be able to sell records. That's why the Rolling
Mhm.
Stones never served any
And the
time. It's
Beatles.
the same with the Beatles because they were the golden goose. And yeah, okay, they got slapped on the hand and they made some excuse that some editorial in the London Evening Times got the Rolling Stones free. No, it wasn't. It was the British music moguls and who kept the Beatles and the Rolling Stones out of jail. And I would imagine it's the same thing for Johnny. Somebody came and, you know, ironed
Can you
things
say
out.
Columbia Records?
Yeah, sure, Columbia
Yes.
Records. Yeah,
Yeah, well, he built that house, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
More or less. Yeah, right. There's some of that going on. I mean, there's also just the way laws are written too. A lot of white musicians, I mean, then as now, use speed, right? And he was abusing prescription drugs, and the penalty for that at the time was essentially nil. Prescription drug abuse hadn't been criminalized yet. So even when he was caught, a lot of the time there was not even really any need for somebody to intervene. You could be sentenced to 1 year to life in a lot of southern states for possession of marijuana. But if you were Johnny, you could have, 300 amphetamine pills, and that was not actually a
Right, you got a few
felony.
free records, a
Yeah,
few free concert tickets, and
no.
nothing happened.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah, so Johnny is able to sing about prisons and incarceration, to sing about crime, to, as you say, sort of toy with the idea that he himself was a criminal. As these lines, I've been on both sides of the bars, etc. But he never spent more than a single night in jail. Arrested 6 times that have been documented, and each time just a single
for
night.
petty stuff. Yeah,
Petty stuff, fairly petty
yeah,
stuff, petty stuff that, other musicians may have done quite a bit more time for.
sure.
The big one obviously is smuggling drugs into the country.
Right,
He was actually potentially looking at quite a bit of time for that,
right.
and got off with a single night. And in the book, he's the counterpoint, right? He's my way of saying, look, if you treat people with some humanity and some grace when they're struggling, look what they can do. And if you don't, right, as with Hughie Ledbetter or Elmo, then you have the ability to really limit and prescribe what people are able to do with their careers, what they're able to say, whether or not people take them seriously as artists. Again, just to make a point of it, Johnny was, to use your term earlier, David, he was a mensch. He started off just using violence and incarceration as rhetorical themes. And in the beginning, I don't think he thought much about it at all. They're venerable country themes, goes back to, English traditionals. And then, he takes this turn. At some point, he starts getting a legitimate interest in the country's history and the history of incarceration. He gets this album called Blues in the Mississippi Night, which a bunch of musicians trading songs and trading stories about the Jim Crow South. And he starts thinking quite deeply about what prison means, what imprisonment means, what it does to people, its role in the country's history. And he starts writing some songs later that never made a fraction of what, Folsom Prison Blues made. But he starts writing some songs later on that are like quite profound, and actually reflective of the country's history, talking about how the Mississippi levees were built by just grabbing people out of bars and charging them with nonsense and putting them onto chain gangs. So he evolved quite a bit. And then later on, he campaigned for politicians who ran on, prison reform. He raised money for prison programming, raised money for a chapel, if memory serves, in the Cummins Prison Farm. I mean, he really made it like a central part of who he was, and he got a couple of musicians out of prison and helped them start their
Right,
careers.
exactly. That was fascinating to learn. And I guess again, Prison was big business back then too. So Johnny's prison reforms, although his heart was in the right place, that's just not how the country runs. And we can look at the statistics now. Prison system gets bigger and bigger every generation. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. There was this moment, and actually, this is a nice segue to talking about Ike White. There was this moment where it wasn't quite bipartisan, but it was as close as you get in America. The idea that prisons, if you're going to lock people up, prison should do something positive for them. That idea actually had some valence in the 60s and the 70s, and you did see a lot of experimentation, right? You saw more programming come in, you saw, restrictions easing, you saw people experimenting with things like, people would be able to work during the week and then check into prison on the weekends, et cetera, et cetera. And this is sort of where Ike's story comes in, and it's one of the reasons that I chose to include him in the book. Ike White was convicted of a single crime. He shot somebody and killed somebody. It was important for me to have somebody in the book. I didn't want this to be a hagiography. I wanted to make clear, just because you've got great musical talent doesn't mean you've never done anything bad.
See that, David?
So yeah, what's that?
Oh, he was making fun of me.
I'm making fun of David.
Yeah, I mean, Ike did kill somebody. He ends up in prison when he's 19, and he has essentially an entire career in there. And when I talk to folks who work on prison reform now, my wife's a public defender. Most of my friends are criminal defense attorneys. Talking to them about what was possible in prison in the late 60s and into the mid 70s, it's night and day. Everything nowadays is incredibly locked down and prescribed. But, Ike was able to take music theory classes. He was able to teach music theory classes.
In prison, yeah.
Yes, right. Eventually, he forms a bunch of bands. He plays with touring bands. Or, I mean, he ends up sharing a stage with Curtis Mayfield, and Eric Burden, and Jimmy Witherspoon, right? Muhammad Ali is the MC for a show he plays in San Quentin. I mean, you can't. These things don't really happen anymore, and so he gets to be.
Well, I think the reason those things don't happen anymore is the people who profit from the prison industrial complex saw their business slipping away.
Well, sure. I mean, this is right. This is the brutal logic of mass incarceration, right? Yeah. If you want to lock up more and more people, ultimately they have to do fewer and fewer things, right? Because there's less and less space. All of the programming that I'm talking about, and running concerts in prison and running classes, all of that takes staffing, which all of that costs money.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, Ike, he had a full career. I don't even know how many bands he formed in prison. Anytime he was moved to a new facility, he'd have at least one band. And sometimes he would be playing in a jazz band in San Quentin, and also a rock band, and also a funk band.
Right, multi-instrumentalist, yeah.
Yes, yep. He was that prolific.
And he had a great band on Changing Times. That's the guys from Santana. That's Doug Roush and I think Michael Shreve, David.
Oh, okay.
Yep, they played and Gregorico on the drums and
Gregorico, there you go.
Yeah. So yeah, eventually, he's discovered while he's in prison, and a label, actually a production company that formed a label just to get his album out.
Right.
Builds an entire recording studio in a prison, gets a big truck, fills it with equipment, converts an old unused storage room in this prison into a recording studio, and he makes this album, which, as you know, was just re-released for the first time in the States.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty remarkable thing. The thing with Ike is, he is also, again, I didn't want the book to be a hagiography. I want it to be true to life. He's also a guy who, after doing about 14 years in prison, never really got it together once he got out. He gets released.
It's sad to see how his life just fell apart. You would think, well, you mentioned in the book that, he was a rock star in prison, but when he got out into the real world, he wasn't a rock star anymore. He was an ex-con.
An ex-con and an ex-con without a great number of connections and no resources to fall back on.
Right.
You also have to realize he had grown up really with four walls around him with these certain disciplines, and then think about you take a puppy who's in not to denigrate, but take a puppy, put it in a crate, all right, and then one day you let it out of your porch, you open the door, that dog's going to go wild.
Sure.
There are just certain things you can't do to a man and expect, them to be reading Proust and going that direction.
Well, you have interview with Ike White. You have some of his quotes, and you see
Right.
he wanted steaks and he wanted to go out and have wine. Sure, I mean this is what they dreamt about in prison, and finally, the accolades and all the critical acclaim he got. And then sadly, they couldn't sell his record. It comes out too late. Tastes change in music, and he's still an ex-con. Record companies don't want an ex-con. How do you market an ex-con?
Well, I disagree with you on that,
You don't think
Tom.
so?
I think, oh yeah, they want to make money. They could care less.
Yeah.
Truly. I mean, think about all the companies that tried to bootleg the Manson tapes. I mean, it's that sick.
But Ike White was absolutely fascinating story, and yes, we see sadly he commits suicide because he just can never get his life together.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, David, to your point, functionally his entire life, when he's released, functionally his entire life had been in prison, right? He commits this murder, gets locked up when he's 19, and then 14 years in prison. So all of his adult experiences essentially come while he's in prison. And one thing that was striking to me, I do research old school, everything's paper, and I'll sort of line it up on my
Have you
desk
ever been to a
sometime.
library? Do you find anything there?
Can you tell?
I do, yes, lots of books. I mean, I've got a little cave here. I like to work in my own space. I don't like to do it in public because people think I'm crazy. Anyway, but one thing I noted actually when I was trying to finish up that section of the book is the extent to which Ike, well, to say Ike could definitely be a scammer, but there was also a way in which he was just beguilingly earnest. And even when he was trying to get out of prison, he would do these interviews. He's like, I have all this talent. I can't wait to make it. Like, I'm going to be big. It's
Reinvent
gonna be
his
great.
past. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like Bob
In
Dylan
this-
in a sense.
Yeah, sure.
You
But
could
in
do
the
it in those
same-
days. There was no Wikipedia.
Absolutely. But in the same interview, he would say things like, I've been twisted by prison, and like prison takes the worst part of you and amplifies it. And, I've been taught, I've been trained, I've been raised with the California prison system to like work any angle to get ahead. And I mean, that is remarkably honest and insightful stuff. And unfortunately, he ended up being right about himself. He got out, and I mean, well, you guys know this better than me, but you need talent in the music industry, but you need money too, right? And by the time he got out, the label had spent a bunch of money on him. He wasn't getting along with the promotions company anymore. And they were just like, we've invested enough. We're not going to put anything behind this album. And so then that was it for him.
Yeah, interesting. Fascinating. Now, I just want to get to Tupac Shakur. Hear me out on my hip-hop theory. I had the experience, I was in the 1980s, when you were a little boy, 1989, I was in a recording studio in Long Island with a band called Public Enemy. And my friend was an engineer on an album called Fear of a Black Planet. And he says, hey, why don't you come over and hear these guys? You got to check this stuff out. Now, rock and roll still ruled the airwaves. David was in David, I believe you had long blonde hair and spandex in California somewhere.
That's right. Spandex, the most forgiving of fabrics.
Yes, it is. And still is, by the way. But David, don't stand up. But anyway.
I'm not wearing pants today.
Okay. So I'm in the recordings. I'm in Hempstead, New York, and I'm listening to Fear of a Black Planet. And I said to my friends, I said, that's it. Rock and roll's done. I go, it was a great run. It was the voice of a young generation. It was the voice of culture. But this, Fear of a Black Planet, is it. It's going to change the whole world. And it did. Okay. And what was happening when you listen to a lot of the rap groups at that time, it was more about them speaking truth to power. And, which goes back to Gil Scott-Heron, which goes back to the Lost Poets and such. And they were setting it to music. And I think what happened is the establishment saw that these people were getting through to young adults. They were getting through to teenagers. So what do we do with hip-hop? Let's flood the market with misogyny and pornographic, rap stars, the Snoop Dogs, and, Baby's Got Back and all that stuff, and dilute the genre. Because hip-hop started off as a political statement. Of course, you had, what was it, Rapper's Delight, things like that.
Right, Grandmaster Flash.
Right, Grandmaster Flash. But most of the rappers were political. And that got destroyed, I would say, by the time the 1990s came around. and you had Yo MTV. They tossed off all the hairband guys, and fortunately, I didn't have hair, David, so I didn't have to worry about
Right. Well,
it.
my wife has a bunch of my hair in a
She
box.
still has David's hair, but I think
Me
that
in
was
that box
done
too.
on purpose with the establishment. Is they took hip hop and made it purposely oversexed, and like I said, misogynist, and to a degree pornographic. I mean, it was pretty upsetting for me to see Snoop Dogg as my representative at the Olympics. And I'm like, look, if the guy wants to make pornography, power to him. But I don't think that should represent the United States. But what are your thoughts? Does my theory have any water?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna come back around to it because I do want to talk about Tupac, and the reason I chose
Yeah.
him, I could have chosen any number of artists who sort of came of age in that era.
Right.
That last section of the book is really about it's chronologically the end point of the book, and it's one thing it's trying to do is talk about the like incredible cultural impact of mass incarceration by the time we get into the 90s.
Right.
To your point, one of the reasons I chose Tupac is his own family's political legacy. His mother, Afeni Shakur, was one of the Panther 21.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Her whole childhood was about fighting police abuses. And she eventually, she gets arrested as part of the Panther 21, has this massively long trial during which he's conceived, and then she's exonerated. That whole experience defines his young life and defines his worldview. And I definitely make a case that, for him at least, and I think you're right, for a lot of young artists, there is, at least rhetorically, a baton pass from the Black Power movement to early hip hop. And, it's at a point when the Black Power movement, to a great extent, has been crushed by the police, has been crushed by the state, has been, observed and surveilled and shot and arrested. And,
Sure.
and for Tupac's generation, the appeal of picking up a gun and fighting isn't there anymore because that way didn't work, right? So what can we do? Well, we can do the same thing as artists. And that is what Tupac is really trying to do early in his career. And he talks about it openly. He says, I'm not a revolutionary. My mother gave her life to the movement. I'm not trying to do that. I want to be a poet. He wore friendship bracelets and he had a pierced ear, and his great aspiration was to be a Shakespearean actor. And, the music thing just happened to work out first. This is how he sees himself. This is how he defines himself, right? His mother's politics with his own means, his own artistic means. And, what happens for him is essentially the same thing that happens for Hughie Ledbetter and for plenty of other artists who I talk about in the book. Before his career even gets going, after his first single comes out, but before his first album is released, he's assaulted by the police in Oakland.
Stopped, yeah.
For nothing. He's stopped, he's jaywalking supposedly, and they beat the ever-loving shit out of him. Well, the result of that is not, let's pity this young man. The result of that is rapper gets arrested, right? So this is sort of his public entree. And then soon after that, a young man named Ronald Ray Howard, just after Tupac's first album comes out, is driving through Texas. He may or may not have been listening to Tupac's music, still sort of unclear. And he gets into a conflict with a state trooper and he kills a state trooper, which is an awful thing. But the result of that is not, however, just that, he faces some penalty for shooting a state trooper. The result of that is that Tupac is then slurred for the crime of this man who he never met and would never meet. And it's, a year plus of headlines talking about the rap murder trial and, this gangster put out a song that caused a cop to get shot, etc. I swear I'm finally coming back around to your question. Tupac's response to this is, look, I was just trying to tell the truth about the world. Right. He said, my first album, it's my report. It is what I've seen. And he is just simply not allowed to do that. Right. And this isn't even record labels at this point. This is the media. The media says, well, this is a young black man, and he is, in the most vague ways possible, associated with violence. One, he's the victim of it. Two, somebody he doesn't know commits it, but they were listening to his music. So we're going to start calling him a gangster. Yeah. And that's what happens. And this becomes his public image. And he violently reacts to that and rejects it. And then eventually decides, fine. If I can't run from it, I'm gonna own it, right? And
Right.
this is sort of the Tupac that most people remember, right?
Right.
He starts lifting weights, he gets all the tattoos, right? That wasn't who he was for the first album.
Fascinating.
But
Yeah.
but once he decides he can't run from this public bias, right? These stereotypes, he's just gonna own them. And to your point about what ends up happening with hip hop, I think yes, some of it probably is labels telling people this is what's popular. I think it's also, the media persistently, at least in that time period, persistently saying this is what we expect of you.
Well, the
Right?
media,
Like,
as someone who worked in television, I can tell you that the media is the voice of the establishment. They are the voice of the power structure.
of course, yeah.
And people were starting to listen to these young hip hop artists, and they wanted them. They wanted to shut them up. And of course, yes, some they can imprison like a Tupac. But if they flood the market, MTV, which is owned by CBS, Viacom, right? They're in bed with the government. All right, so let's flood the market with the pornographic, misogynist rap, and that's what people's white America's imagery of rap is. It's Baby's Got Back. It's TLC running around in their bikinis. It's not it's not the Erica Badu's and the Commons.
It actually is the premonition fear of a black planet. I mean, so.
Yeah, it's exactly what it
Yes.
exactly.
Yes, one of the great albums
And even
great album titles
even
of all
public image is marginalized eventually, because that was it for them after that record. I don't think Flava Flav got exploited. I mean, he got the rock star bug, but the other guys, I can't think of his name, Chuck D, I guess.
Chuck D, yeah.
Chuck D stayed close to his principles, but by then, LIGO's halfway around the world before Truth gets its boots on. That was their imagery.
Yeah. I mean, I don't go too much into Public Enemy in the book, although they get some mentions, but definitely a fan. And I'm trying to remember, they put out a song that really got a ton of blowback. I think by the time I get to Arizona, and Arizona had gotten rid of the MLK holiday or refused to pass it or
Yes, right,
something.
exactly.
And they made a song protesting that, and that was the moment at which, to use your term, right, the mainstream or the establishment had really had enough of Public Enemy.
Well, Chuck D responds by saying that rap music is CNN for black people. That was his quote. So that shook up the establishment. So they take MTV, they throw all the hair bands off, and everything is, misogynist rap music, and then that morphs into Jersey Shore, and so goes the network.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't give rock a total pass. There's plenty of misogyny in rock as well.
Well, of
plenty
course,
of bikini-clad women and.
And there was nothing wrong with that. The difference with that, as the only difference with that is that was P.T. Barnum. It wasn't a political thing.
I think it was.
No.
I mean, there was P.T. Barnum elements to it. Sure, sex always sells. Not in the Gross household, but everywhere else.
No,
Still paying for it.
There was a great, what was it? Rodney Dangerfield on The Tonight Show.
What?
He goes, my wife and I had an anniversary. And I said to her, why don't we take it back to the beginning? And she said, well, give me $20. So,
but yes, obviously, but I think that was more of a political statement. And then I don't think, MTV was also, obviously it was the grunge era and things, but that I think a lot of the grunge and the pain, the Kurt Cobain was more introspective. It wasn't outward looking. A lot of the grunge artists, they didn't really address political topics pretty much and things like that. But CNN, Public Enemy, same thing, was speaking truth to power, and that had to stop. And then, of course, you see now, gosh, after 9/11, Imagine was banned from iHeartRadio because we got to support the troops. So,
yeah.
But fascinating book. I wanted to ask you, how difficult was this to research? Because a lot of this stuff could not have been accurately documented. I mean, when you talk about Lead Belly and Ike White and things, I mean, the accurate records weren't kept like they are now. They didn't have the digital leash that we have now, where every time you do something, you have to download an app and get a pass key. Was this a difficult book to research?
Yeah, thank you for the question. my first book was a literary biography that was a beast. It took me 6.5 years. Tons of archival research, tons of interviews. This one was a little bit different, and interesting for me as a writer. Three of the characters are fairly well known, right? I mean, Leadbelly, Johnny, and Tupac, and they all had existing biographies that were well
Sure, yeah.
researched and reliable. So in those sections, a lot of it I'm relying on the established record. I was doing some archival research in there, but in those sections I allowed myself to be like quite a bit more essayistic, right? The Leadbelly section ends up being a lot about what Southern justice looked like at the time, which is also something that's been pretty well academically recorded. Or it's about the development of lyrics and rhetorical style and talking about prisons. Leadbelly disappears from that section sometimes for, pages at a time when I'm allowing myself to riff. And the way I ended up thinking about it is that I have that leeway, right? People, if you know the name, you already have an image of him. So there are things I definitely want to set the record straight on, the details of his arrests as well as they could be established. But beyond that, I'm not going to tell you what he preferred to eat for breakfast, right? I'm talking about what his place in the history is. Sort of the same thing for Johnny and for Tupac, right? Most people have an image of them. They probably see the photo on the cover and they've already got an idea of what they think about them. But then for the other two, for Elmo Hope and for Ike White, the research was a bit more challenging. In Elmo, I did have some benefits. His wife is still alive. Bertha Hope is a genius in her own right. She's almost 90. When I was fact checking the book, I called her up, and at the end, she's like, "Just by the way, I'm looking for a new booking agent. If you know anybody." She's still
great player.
She still yeah, she still gigs. I saw her live twice a couple years ago. So she didn't know Elmo when he was young, but for the later stuff, she was a real resource. I got to interview Lou Donaldson before he passed, who played with Elmo in the 50s. And then the real boon with him, I mean, this is the sort of thing biographers dream about. Elmo only gave one substantial interview on the record ever. And that's what I lead the chapter with, in part just because it's like the only time you really hear his voice ever. I was like, this needs to be first. And so, I was working with what had already been published about him. I was working with interviews, and then I was at the Municipal Archives in New York, and I'll spare you all the gory details, but it took several visits, but eventually the New York City Municipal Archives turned up just this huge tranche of information about him, which, as far as I know, nobody had ever looked at before. I didn't even know it existed until the archivist found it for me, and it was his probation records.
Wow.
If you talk to somebody who works in the criminal justice system in New York today, they'll tell you, probation interview is a very perfunctory thing. They don't spend any time on it. But what I discovered is in the 50s, 60s, it was extensive. So there's all these interviews with Elmo and people from probation and social workers. They're recounting his whole employment history because they're trying to verify when he was working. So they've got lists of who he was playing with and gigging with. Interviewed him about his childhood, interviewed his mother about his childhood, reached out to people in his life to see if they would, send him letters of support. So that was just incredibly valuable in terms of putting together the timeline. And it also contained tons of court records. So then a lot of, where you do see these intimate scenes in the book, it's court records. He's in court and the judge is talking and the district attorney is talking, and Elmo, unfortunately, is mostly there silent. And that was, like I said, just luck. I thought honestly that if I was going to write that section, it was also going to be more essayistic, and it would be about the development of modern jazz and like where his music fits into that. And it was just great luck to find all that stuff. Ike was sort of a mixed bag. There are a decent number of people around who interacted with Ike near the end of his life. So I was able to interview folks. There's a journalist who really campaigned to get him out. I was able to interview her.
Oh, yes.
She did, I think, a 2 hour long or maybe hour and a half long radio special where she interviewed him and just kind of lets him talk. That was incredibly valuable. I talked to some folks who helped campaign to get him out and then saw him on the outside. So there's all that stuff. He also he pops up in the prison newspapers quite a bit. And a lot of that section, at least in terms of volume and word count, circles around his what you call his incident offense, the crime that he committed and was convicted for, which was extensively covered in the newspapers.
Right.
So for him, it was a mixed bag too. There's also a reason it's the shortest section of the book because there just wasn't as much information as I would have liked. So it jumps around a bit, and it ends up being also it's the only section that takes place largely in a prison. That was intentional. I wanted something about, prison culture, especially during that reform period. So a lot of it is just about what's happening at San Quentin while he's in there. So Ike also, I think there's a 5-page section where he's just not there. It's the history of San Quentin, and it's talking about all the stuff that's happening in the prison while he's there, which, would have been affecting him and influencing him, and trying to make the case, make this point that he's working on his musical talent, but all around him, people are fighting, people are rioting, the guards are locking people up, people are dying in yard fights. And I can't say definitively that's how, these things influence his music in this way. But for the reader, I want to make it clear, right? This is not a guy who just gets to sit in a quiet room and run chords all day either.
Yeah. Well, you just talked about just how messed up his instrument was. Right. But interesting that musicians had special privileges. One more thing I've got to ask you is, I think this is on the website. It says, despite the fact that he writes books about musicians, Colin has no musical talent. But David, that did not stop him from spending what is...
Didn't stop you either.
Didn't stop me either. Spending one of the best years of his life, notice it's one of the best years of life, playing in a band with Spencer Ackerman, who is a website I've read often, Forever Wars. Tell me about your rock and roll career. What did that entail?
There was no rock and roll career, but Spence and I did have a band back when Spence is a year older than me. I think I would have been in middle school and he would have been in high school.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I yelled into a mic and he played competent drums.
Okay. I was afraid he was going to say he was a bass player, David.
No.
Okay, good.
Singer and songwriter, in as much as I can even call myself that. But Spence has got a book coming out next year. If anybody who's listening doesn't know the name, you should check Spencer out. He's
Forever Wars,
one of the best. Yeah.
Reports on American military.
I got a question for you. There was a terrible a recreation of Hootie's life, and until I read this book, I thought it was correct, but the thing was completely inaccurate. Do you know which the name of that movie was?
I don't. I know what you're talking about, though.
Yeah, it was terrible. It really was. When you think about all the research you did, that movie was just insanely inaccurate.
Yeah, I mean, plenty of stuff. As a writer, there are things that like stick in your craw that other people won't even notice. But Hudie is one of those things. If you Google him right now, I don't know if it's true in this moment, but when I was still fact checking, if you Google Hudie, one of the first things that comes up is some article that's like, America's first gangster, or like music's first gangster or something. All of this stuff that was put out of ignorance in 1935 is still floating around, man. I mean, if you Google him, you will probably find more articles than not that say he was twice convicted of murder, which is just not, is not true. Even in 1935, everybody knew it was not true, but it was just a better story. Like, it was just better to promote him, to make him seem as savage as possible.
Right, that was
all of that shit is still floating around the culture's bloodstream. But yes, there was this film. It didn't get a wide theatrical release, and I'm gonna totally space on the name right now. But yes, pretty offensive. There was also a novel that had a limited release in the 60s that played to the same tropes, that just presents him as this like hypersexualized, violent man-child, which, according to everybody who actually knew him, couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, this is when myths sometimes have the greatest power, right? When they are so contrary to reality. I mean, this is a man who wouldn't leave the house without a freshly pressed suit, refused to carry his guitar anywhere unless he had a case, because that would have been unprofessional, shined his shoes every morning. He was a serious human being who wanted to be taken seriously, and incredibly dignified. So, I think that one of the reasons the myths are so powerful is that they just attack all of that, right? They attack the talent, they attack the dignity, and they're still out there.
Oh yeah.
Well, I got to tell you, as I said earlier, it's a great book.
It's a fabulous
Thank
book.
you.
Colin, what's your next book? Come on, you gotta get to work. What's
Oh
next?
man, everybody asks. I don't have anything solid yet. I got a couple ideas. My agent wants me to pitch her on some ideas before the end of the summer, so I got to turn them into some more material, but I don't have a good answer for you,
All
unfortunately.
right. He pleads the fifth, David. All right, Colin,
I
thanks
do.
so much for being on the show. We'll send you links so you can break the internet like a Kardashian. Hopefully sell a few books for you. And keep us posted on what you're doing.
I will. Thank you guys for having me on. It was a
All
pleasure.
right, thanks so much. Take care.
Bye-bye now.
David, what a pleasure to have Colin Asher on the show. We had him discuss his latest book, The Midnight Special, The Secret Prison History of American Music, which is out on Norton Books right now. You can get it in a hard copy or you can get a digital format. And fascinating book and a topic that we don't discuss much on our podcast, the prison industrial complex.
Well, that's only because once we left prison, we didn't really want to talk much about
But
it.
we're in our own personal prison right now.
That's it. I've been in the personal prison. My mind is completely behind bars. Speaking of which, I think we should go to the bars.
One of the fascinating things about this book is thanks to digital technology and streaming, we can hear the music that Colin details in this book. We're from Tupac Shakur to Ike White to Johnny Cash. David, what do you have for our playlist?
First of all, there were 5 people in the book that were profiled: Elmo Hope, Leadbelly, Tupac Shakur, Ike White, Johnny Cash. But there was one record, and I think you were even listening to it when we spoke about a week or so ago, was Calvin Levy doing Cummins Prison. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And I think that was one of the records that spurned Colin on to do this book. We have 4 tunes by Leadbelly, about 5 tunes by Elmo Hope. By the way, Elmo Hope was one of my favorite keyboard players. I discovered him about 2 years ago, and what a brilliant piano player. Ike White, who I never knew this guy existed, and what a great soul record, right?
It is it's a fabulous record, and you have members of Santana actually on that record, the late great Doug Roush. I think Greg Errico from Sly and the Family Stone. I think Michael Shreve is on that record. Interesting because I'm always perusing the reissue record bins, and I'd seen Ike White, and I said, wow, this looks like a cool record. I wonder who this guy is. And then, of course, the book drops in our lap. But yes, another episode where we discover stuff that we missed the first time around.
And also, I think a lot of the stuff on Johnny Cash, I did not know. So we have some Johnny Cash songs and some Tupac Shakur songs.
Yeah, the Tupac segments are fascinating, and I am going to read up more about Tupac Shakur. But once again, Notes from an Artist. David, what can I say about Notes from an Artist that I haven't said before? We are in the top 9% of all registered podcasts on the planet Earth, which is 33.2 million last time I checked. David, how many countries are we in?
We are in 157 countries.
Wow. And how many territories does that include?
I don't get into territories anymore, you know. They're just,
okay.
they don't count.
Countries. How about cities? I last counted 2,221. Have we gone up from that?
Wow, have we? We're at 2,682.
I'm going to make a note of that. And again,
I didn't know there were that many cities in the world.
I didn't know there were that many cities. And of course, we've had so many great authors and musicians on the show, and author-musicians, among them Phil Manzanera, Ron Carter, Bill Wyman, Steve Hackett, Glenn Matlock, Richard Thompson, Bob Gruen, great episode we did a few years ago, Anil Prasad, David Less, who we get into our big weather report kerfuffle, and Phil Freeman, fabulous author who we'll have back on again. So do look in the Notes from an Artist archives.
And where can you find these great things?
Well, you find them, David, on the streaming services, I guess. Apple, Amazon, Buzzsprout, Spotify, Pandora, and wherever podcasts are podified.
This is so true. The thing that I love about this show is that it is as improvisational as an AI band.
As an AI band. You know what, David? Let's talk about the music we're working on. You're doing some fabulous soundtrack work. I just released a dub compilation, so let's have ourselves back on the show.
If we can get invited on, we should do that.
We'll send invitations to ourselves. Thanks for listening. My name is Tomaso Semioli.
I'm David C. Gross.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.
No matter what shape your stomach's in, when it gets out of shape, take Alka-Seltzer. Alka-Seltzer relieves the flutters, calms the nervous feeling, relieves heartburn, relieves the stuffy feeling, and relieves a headache. Better than any other antacid. Better than anything you can get without a prescription. Anything. Alka-Seltzer. It's the best. On any stomach.
You gotta fucking be kidding me! Kidding me! Kidding me! How dare you call yourselves professional?
Through unforeseen circumstances, this show will remain on the air until further notice.